Good evening, friend. Tonight, let's step back into the 1960s, a world that feels close enough to touch, yet distant enough to seem like a dream. It was a time of jukeboxes and milk deliveries, drive-in theaters, and Sunday drives. But it was also a decade of upheaval, where shadows lingered behind the glow of neon signs and polished chrome. The everyday objects we'll talk about weren't just things, they were lifelines. Small anchors that held families and communities together in a world that was changing faster than anyone could keep up. If you find comfort in these little journeys, go ahead and like or subscribe, but only if it feels right. And before we drift back, leave me a note in the comments. Where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? I love knowing the constellation we quietly make together. I remember the rotary phone as clearly as if it were still sitting on the little table by the living room wall. Ours was a solid black model, heavy enough that if you dropped it on your foot, you would not forget it. The dial had finger holes that clicked and spun back into place with a sound that filled the room, each number taking its time to rotate. Calling someone was never quick. If you dialed a wrong number, you had to start all over again. Patient as could be. Long-distance calls were treated almost like special occasions. Mama would tell us to hush when Daddy was on the line with Aunt Ruth out in California, because every minute cost real money. We did not chatter endlessly as folks do now. We waited our turn. We spoke carefully, and then we hung up. That telephone was not only for convenience. It was a piece of furniture, with its own little stand and a place for the phone book tucked underneath. I can still see my brother Charlie pulling the cord as far as it would stretch, hiding in the hallway to talk with his friends, his voice low and secretive. The phone was private yet public all at once. Everyone could hear if you lingered too long. That is how it was, plain and simple, and we accepted it without question. Party lines were one of those peculiar things that younger folks today can hardly imagine. In many small towns during the 1960s, not every household had its own private telephone line. Instead, several families shared one. When the phone rang, you listened closely for the pattern. 2 short rings might mean it was for us, while a long ring and a short one might be for the neighbors. There was no such thing as guaranteed privacy. If you lifted the receiver gently, you could hear someone else's conversation humming faintly. Most of us minded our manners, but there were always a few curious souls who stayed quiet on the line, just to listen in. Mama had sharp ears, and more than once she would tell us to hang it up quick if she caught us being nosy. At the same time, party lines created a strange sense of community. If there was an emergency, neighbors would clear the line without hesitation. If Mrs. Crandall's husband had taken ill, word traveled faster than a newspaper headline. I remember one winter storm when the phone lines crackled with messages of concern, each household checking in on the others. Of course, there was frustration too. Sometimes you waited and waited for the line to be free, drumming your fingers on the table while someone down the road carried on about nothing in particular. Still, for all the inconvenience, the party line was part of our lives, an unspoken bond that connected houses in ways that cell phones never will. It was a shared thread running through the quiet streets of our little town, and it reminded us daily that none of us lived entirely apart from one another. Sunday drives were a ritual in our family, as steady as church in the morning and supper in the evening. After Mama finished tidying the kitchen and Daddy had settled with his newspaper, we would all pile into the car for a slow ride through the countryside. The pace was never hurried. Gas was cheap, the roads were quieter than they are now, and there was no pressing reason to be anywhere else. Daddy would drive with one arm resting out the window, letting the warm breeze roll through, while Mama pointed out fields where corn was coming in or barns that had been newly painted. Sometimes Charlie and I would fight over who got the window seat, because the view seemed better with the glass down and the air rushing against your face. There was a comfort in those drives, an unspoken togetherness that did not need much talking. Sometimes we stopped for ice cream cones, Sometimes we drove by relatives' houses just to wave, and other times we simply circled back home, content to have been out. The radio hummed softly, often country or early rock and roll, and the car itself became our moving porch, a little place where we could look out at the world beyond our town. I can still remember the smell of the vinyl seats warming in the sun, the way Mama would remind us to sit up straight, and the feeling that those drives were less about where we went and more about the quiet rhythm of being together. They were ordinary in the best possible way, part of the fabric of life that stitched the weeks together. Green stamps were everywhere in the 1960s, and they were almost like a second form of currency in the home. Whenever Mama went grocery shopping or Daddy filled the car with gas, the cashier would hand back little sheets of trading stamps along with the receipt. Mama kept a special drawer just for them, and when she got home, she would carefully lick each one and press it into the pages of the thick stamp books. I can still see her sitting at the kitchen table with a damp sponge in a shallow dish, working methodically, while I sat beside her and helped. It became almost like a game, filling one page and then another until the book was fat and ready to be redeemed. The green stamp store felt magical to me as a child, like walking into a secret warehouse where the price tags had vanished. You could trade completed books for toasters, lamps, dishes, or even bicycles if you saved enough. Mama would study the catalog as if it were scripture, circling things she thought the family might need. I remember when she saved enough to get us a new iron, and how proud she looked carrying it home, knowing it had cost her nothing but persistence. For families stretching $1, green stamps were more than a novelty. They were a promise that patience could turn into something useful, a little reward for the ordinary shopping we had to do anyway. Even though the items were modest, the excitement of redeeming them made the whole family feel like winners. It was a quiet kind of joy, tucked into everyday life, and part of the rhythm of running a household. Our first television was a black and white set, big and boxy, with knobs that clunked loudly when you turned them. It sat in the living room like an honored guest, and when it was on, the whole family gathered around, as if nothing else in the world mattered. The picture was grainy, sometimes fuzzy, and if the antenna was not angled just right, the screen would fill with snow. Charlie was usually the one climbing behind the set, twisting the rabbit ears while Daddy shouted, "There, hold it there," from the sofa. We only had a handful of channels, and they went off the air at night with the national anthem, leaving just a test pattern and a hum. But to us, that glowing box was magic. Saturday mornings were my favorite, when cartoons played and I could sit on the floor in my pajamas with a bowl of cereal. Mama liked her soap operas in the afternoon, stories full of drama and whispered secrets. Daddy watched the evening news faithfully, his brow furrowed as he listened to Walter Cronkite. Everything felt shared. You could not retreat to your own screen. You all watched together, laughing at the same jokes or shaking your heads at the same commercials. Looking back, I realized that little black and white picture tied us together. The limitations of it, the static, the small selection, the short broadcast day did not feel like burdens. They were simply part of the experience, part of the charm. It was not about choice or endless variety. It was about presence, being there with each other, and letting the flickering images carry us all into the same story for a while. Before computers and search engines, the encyclopedia was the crown jewel of knowledge in a household. Ours was a full set of World Book volumes, lined up neatly on a bookshelf in the living room. The spines gleamed white with gold lettering, and to me they seemed almost sacred, as though opening one would let you glimpse the entire world. Whenever I had a school project, Mama would tell me to look it up, and that meant pulling down the right volume and flipping through its thin, glossy pages until I found what I needed. Of course, sometimes I got distracted. I would start out reading about the state of Ohio and end up lost in pictures of faraway countries, or sketches of strange animals I had never seen. There was a thrill in it because the information felt permanent and reliable, something you could trust. Even Charlie, who wasn't much of a reader, would sit cross-legged on the floor turning pages, mostly looking at the photographs of rockets or airplanes. The encyclopedia was not just for schoolwork either. If an argument broke out at the supper table about who invented something or what year an event took place, Daddy would say, "Get the book." That ended the discussion because the encyclopedia had the final word. I can still remember the smell of the paper, the weight of the volume in my lap, and the quiet rustle as I turned the pages. It was not quick like typing into a box today, but there was something satisfying in the hunt, something patient and grounding. In those books, the world came to us in neat alphabetical order, a universe bound in cloth and ink. The milkman was as much a part of our mornings as the sunrise. In the 1960s, it was common to have milk delivered right to your doorstep, and our family relied on it. I can still see the glass bottles clinking softly as he set them down in the metal carrier by the porch. Each one had a little cardboard cap that you popped out with your finger, and when Mama poured it into a glass, the cream would sometimes rise to the top. There was no plastic, no cartons yet, just sturdy bottles that the milkman would collect when he dropped off the fresh ones. His arrival was dependable, and there was comfort in knowing that even on the coldest winter mornings, when the bottles froze and the cream pushed the cap up into a little column of ice, the milk would be there. Mama planned her cooking around it. If she wanted to make biscuits, pudding, or custard, she knew she could count on that delivery. For us children, it was a small bit of magic. Waking up and finding proof that someone had come quietly in the night or early dawn, leaving nourishment at the door. The milkman was more than just a delivery man. He was a friendly face who might chat a moment with Mama, asking after the family, or passing along news from around town. Looking back, I realize how personal it all was, how different from walking down a grocery aisle today. The milk came fresh, in bottles that were washed and used again, and the whole thing carried a sense of routine and care. It tied us not just to the farm where the milk was produced, but to the people in our own neighborhood. The sound of a typewriter is something you don't forget. In the 1960s, that steady clacking of keys striking the paper was the rhythm of offices, schools, and sometimes even our homes. Mama had one she used when she needed to type up letters for church or the PTA, and I used to watch her hands fly across the keys with practiced speed. Each letter struck left a little impression, a tiny physical mark that meant there was no going back. Mistakes had to be fixed with correction fluid, or those thin white strips you slipped in and retyped over. There was no delete button, no backspace that erased your errors, only patience and precision. I remember trying it myself, the way the keys resisted until you pressed firmly enough, and the bell that chimed at the end of a line to remind you to push the carriage back with a satisfying sweep. It felt powerful, almost adult, to sit there and make words appear one by one on a clean sheet of paper. The ribbons of ink were messy, and sometimes your fingers came away smudged, but that was part of the process. In schools, typewriting classes were considered an important skill, especially for girls, because secretarial work was a common path. Looking back, there was something grounding about the typewriter. It was noisy, deliberate, and you could hear productivity in every stroke. Compared to today's quiet keyboards, it carried a weight, both literal and symbolic. You could not type without meaning it. Each page you finished was a small accomplishment, solid and real, smelling faintly of ink and effort. Jukeboxes were everywhere in the 1960s, glowing like little beacons of sound in diners, soda fountains, and bowling alleys. To us kids, they were part machine and part magic. For a dime, sometimes just a nickel, you could press a few buttons and suddenly the whole room filled with music. The glass front displayed rows of song titles, each one written on a small card. and I remember scanning them with Charlie, debating whether to pick Elvis, the Supremes, or maybe something from the Beatles if it had been updated recently. The jukebox lights blinked softly, casting a warm glow as the arm lifted a record and set the needle down with a faint crackle. Then came the music, clear and rich, turning an ordinary hamburger or milkshake into something special. Teenagers leaned against the counters, snapping their fingers, tapping their shoes, and sometimes even getting up to dance right there between the booths. For families, it was an easy kind of entertainment, a way to share the popular songs of the day without owning every record. I can still remember Mama humming along to Patsy Cline while Daddy sipped his coffee, both of them smiling in that easy, content way. The jukebox belonged to everyone, and yet it felt personal because you chose the soundtrack for those few minutes. It was democratic and joyful, giving a voice to anyone with a coin in their pocket. Looking back, I think that's why it stuck with me. The jukebox wasn't just about music. It was about choice, togetherness, and the way one song could change the whole mood of a place. Rotary phones were the heartbeat of communication in the 1960s. Every home had one, usually heavy and solid, with that familiar circular dial in the center. Ours sat on a little table in the hallway, the kind of spot chosen so everyone could reach it but no one could hog it for too long. Using it required patience. You slipped your finger into the right hole, spun the dial until it clicked against the metal stop, then waited for it to spin back before starting the next number. If you misdialed, you had to start all over again. The sound of the rotary turning and whirring back was a music of its own, soft and mechanical, filling the silence between rings. Long-distance calls were expensive and carefully timed, with Mama watching the clock to be sure we didn't go over. Sometimes the line would crackle or carry an echo, reminding you that your words were traveling through miles of wire strung across poles and fields. We even shared a party line for a while, which meant you had to pick up the receiver and check if the neighbors were using it before making a call. Privacy was rare, and everyone in the family could hear your side of the conversation if they walked by. Still, that phone connected us to the outside world in a way nothing else could. The ring itself was sharp and commanding, pulling you out of whatever you were doing. It could be news, a neighbor, or just Grandma checking in. Each call felt important, because the effort and expense gave it weight. That rotary phone was more than an object, it was a lifeline. Sunday drives were as much a tradition in the 1960s as Sunday supper. After church and a hearty meal, Daddy would sometimes announce that we were going for a drive. And just like that, we all piled into the family car. There was no destination most of the time. The point was simply to be together, riding the back roads, letting the world roll by the windows. Gas was cheap enough back then that it wasn't considered wasteful, and the car itself felt like a kind of freedom. I remember leaning against the warm vinyl seat, the wind slipping in through the small vent windows, and the radio humming softly with country music or the latest pop hits. Mama would point out houses she liked or gardens that were blooming, while Charlie and I counted cows in the fields or waved at people sitting on their porches. Sometimes we stopped at a roadside stand for ice cream or a soda, and it felt like a grand treat, even if it cost only a few cents. There was an unhurried rhythm to it all. No rush, no clock ticking in the background. Just the open road and the simple joy of movement. Looking back, I realize it was less about seeing something new and more about settling into that shared quiet, where no one needed to talk too much because the drive itself said enough. Families today might go shopping or to the movies, but in those years, just driving together was its own form of entertainment. Those Sunday drives stitched us into the landscape of our community, mile by mile, making ordinary roads feel like pathways to memory. Green stamps were one of those little rewards that seemed to touch nearly every household in the 1960s. Whenever Mama bought groceries, the clerk would hand her a neat stack of stamps, along with the receipt, and we kids knew our job was to lick them and stick them into the pages of the booklets. The glue tasted a bit like paper and chemicals, but we didn't mind. It felt like building something valuable out of scraps. Once the books were filled, Mama would tuck them away in a drawer until she had enough to trade in for something bigger. I can still remember flipping through the catalog, marveling at the items you could get everything from kitchen appliances to lamps to toys. For families on a tight budget, it felt like a way to stretch the dollar just a little further, and there was a kind of excitement in knowing that all those small purchases added up to something tangible. I remember when Mama saved enough stamps to get a new set of mixing bowls. She showed them off with quiet pride, because they were earned, not bought outright. The program made shopping feel like a small treasure hunt, turning ordinary errands into something more rewarding. It also gave children like me a sense of participation, because we helped by pasting in the stamps, flipping through the catalog, and dreaming right along with our parents. Looking back, green stamps were about more than free merchandise. They carried a sense of possibility, a reminder that patience and small efforts could be exchanged for something lasting. It was a lesson in value disguised as a fun family chore. Soda fountains were a gathering place in the 1960s, a mix of refreshment and community that you just don't find anymore. Ours was tucked into the corner of the local drugstore, with a long counter lined by shiny stools that swiveled if you pushed them hard enough. The air smelled faintly of syrup, coffee, and the metal of the fountain itself. Behind the counter, the soda jerk worked with a kind of flair, pulling the handles, mixing carbonated water with flavored syrups, and scooping ice cream into tall glasses for floats or sundaes. For a few coins, you could have a cherry Coke or a root beer float, and it felt like pure luxury. Teenagers often gathered there after school, laughing, flirting, and sharing French fries, while younger kids like me pressed our noses against the glass of the candy case, hoping for a treat. Mama sometimes took me there as a special reward, and I can still recall the coolness of the glass in my hand, the fizz that tickled my nose, and the way time seemed to slow as we lingered on those stools. It wasn't just about the drink, it was about being part of something, a small-town rhythm that brought people together. Even grown folks stopped in to chat, read the paper, or enjoy a simple cup of coffee. The soda fountain was more than a place to quench thirst. It was a stage for friendships, first dates, and neighborhood news, all carried out under the hum of fluorescent lights and the clink of spoons against glass. Looking back, I realized those fizzy drinks tasted so sweet partly because they were shared in a space filled with warmth and familiarity. Encyclopedias were once the backbone of learning in nearly every home during the 1960s. Ours sat proudly on a shelf in the living room, a full set of thick, heavy volumes with gold lettering along the spines. They looked important, and in truth, they were. If you had a question about presidents, animals, faraway countries, or even how machines worked, you didn't reach for a phone or a computer, you reached for the encyclopedia. I remember pulling one off the shelf, feeling its weight, and flipping through the glossy pages filled with photographs, maps, and neat columns of text. The smell of the paper was comforting, slightly musty, even when new, and the sound of the pages turning was part of the experience. For school projects, Charlie and I both relied on those books, carefully copying information by hand into our notebooks. Mama encouraged it because she believed a set of encyclopedias was an investment in our education, even though they were expensive and often bought through installments. Sometimes I would sit with one just to wander through the alphabet, starting in A, and letting my curiosity carry me along. They were not just books but doorways to a bigger world, at a time when travel was rare and television was limited to only a handful of channels. Of course, the information grew outdated quickly, but we didn't know that then. To us, they were authoritative, and they gave us confidence that answers could always be found if we just looked in the right volume. Encyclopedias represented the hope of knowledge and the belief that learning could be held right in your hands. Typewriters were as common in homes and offices during the 1960s as laptops are today. Ours sat on a small desk near the window, a sturdy machine with round keys that clacked loudly when pressed. Each letter struck the ribbon and left its sharp impression on the paper, a sound so distinct you could almost hear the rhythm of thought itself. There was no backspace to delete mistakes, only correction fluid or small strips of white tape that could cover an error if you were careful. Mama used the typewriter often for letters or recipes, and later, when I got older, I tapped out school reports on it. It took strength in your fingers, more than most realize, and the keys sometimes stuck if you pressed too quickly. The carriage return was its own ritual. At the end of a line, you slid the lever with a decisive push, hearing the bell ring to signal a new start. That sound filled the room with a steady music that meant work was being done. The ribbon itself needed changing now and then, leaving your fingertips smudged with ink. For many families, a typewriter symbolized progress, literacy, and connection, allowing them to produce neat, legible words far beyond what handwriting could manage. Businesses depended on them, students learned on them, and even secretaries built entire careers around their speed and precision. Looking back, the typewriter carried a kind of dignity. It demanded patience, attention, and effort, and in return, it gave permanence to every word you set upon the page. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what's hidden. Party lines were one of those quirks of telephone life in the 1960s that people today can hardly imagine. Instead of each home having its own private line, several households in the same area would share a single connection. When you lifted the receiver, you might hear your neighbor already chatting away, and you had to wait politely until they were finished before making your own call. Sometimes, if the conversation was too interesting, folks were tempted to quietly listen in, though everyone knew it was considered nosy and rude. In our house, Mama kept a strict rule about never eavesdropping, though I admit as a child I found it hard not to be curious about the voices drifting through. Each family was assigned a distinct ring pattern, perhaps 2 short rings or 1 long and 1 short, and you learned quickly to tell which call was meant for you. The system required patience and a sense of neighborly cooperation, because no one could monopolize the line. I remember Mama growing frustrated when she needed to call Daddy at work, and the line stayed busy with someone else's long story. Yet, in its own way, the party line reinforced the closeness of community. Neighbors knew each other's habits, voices, and even worries, simply by the nature of shared wires. Eventually, private lines became more common, and party lines faded into memory. But for those of us who grew up with them, the party line was a reminder that life was lived more publicly, and that privacy was a luxury we hadn't yet thought to expect. Adding machines were the heartbeat of bookkeeping and business in the 1960s. Before calculators became small and affordable, every store clerk, bank teller, and secretary relied on these sturdy machines with their rows of keys and rolls of paper. I remember the one Daddy used at work. Its sound a sharp clicking followed by the heavy thunk of the lever as it printed the answer. The paper tape wound into neat curls that sometimes fell to the floor, each strip recording every number punched in. Even at school, teachers used adding machines for accuracy when preparing grades or balancing figures. At home, I once had the treat of pressing the keys myself, fascinated by the way the numbers stacked so neatly on the tape. It felt like magic to see sums appear instantly, without the need for pencil and paper. Yet these machines were not flawless. If you pressed the wrong key, the mistake rolled out just the same, and you had to strike through the error and start again. Offices echoed with their clatter, a steady rhythm that became background music to work. They were heavy, mechanical, and built to last, a far cry from today's plastic calculators. The adding machine symbolized precision and trust, a tool that made modern commerce possible in its time. For families who didn't own one, The sound was still familiar from visits to stores, where clerks tapped out totals before bagging up purchases. Looking back, I realized they were part of a world that valued visible proof, every total spelled out in ink, with no hidden shortcuts. Milk deliveries were still common in the 1960s, even as supermarkets grew in popularity. I can see it plain as day, the clink of glass bottles against each other as the milkman carried his wire rack up to the porch. Ours came in the early morning, and sometimes I'd be awake just enough to hear the soft thud of the bottles being set down by the door. The milk itself was fresh, cold, and often topped with a layer of cream that Mama would carefully skim off for baking or her morning coffee. Each bottle had a cardboard cap that popped off with a satisfying pull, and once emptied, the bottles were rinsed and left out to be collected and used again. It was a system built on trust and routine, the kind of rhythm that tied neighborhoods together. I remember how the milk truck seemed like part of the landscape, chugging down the street with its back doors open, carrying not just milk but butter, cream, and sometimes even eggs. For families like ours, it was one less errand, a quiet convenience that kept the kitchen stocked. The milkman often knew his customers by name, asking after families or pausing for a quick word if he caught someone outside. Over time, as grocery stores expanded and plastic cartons replaced glass, the daily deliveries faded. But for a while, they felt like a small luxury, the world brought right to your doorstep. It was a service that blended practicality with a touch of neighborly care, something that today feels almost too personal to imagine. Record players were at the center of so many living rooms in the 1960s, spinning music that defined both the decade and our memories. Our family had a console model, a piece of furniture as much as a machine, with wood paneling and a lid that lifted to reveal the turntable. I can still recall the ritual of sliding a vinyl record out of its sleeve, careful not to smudge the grooves, and setting it gently onto the platter. The needle dropped with a soft crackle, and then the room filled with sound, sometimes Elvis, sometimes the Supremes, sometimes a symphony. Mama loved on quiet Sunday afternoons. That crackle was part of the charm, a reminder that music was alive in the grooves. Friends would gather around, flipping records and stacking them to play one after another, and each one felt like an event. For teenagers, the record player was a doorway to independence, spinning the latest singles at parties, and even learning the dances that went with them. Albums became more than just collections of songs. They were part of an identity, a way of showing who you were and what you cared about. The record player taught patience, too. If you wanted to hear your favorite track again, you had to lift the arm and place the needle back in the exact spot. It made you slow down, listen closely, and give music the attention it deserved. Though technology moved on to cassettes and beyond, the memory of those spinning discs and the warmth of their sound lingers even now, like an old song that never quite leaves you. Soda pop in glass bottles was one of the small joys of the 1960s, a treat that felt both ordinary and special at the same time. I remember walking into the corner store and heading straight for the big red cooler filled with icy water, where rows of glass bottles stood waiting. You lifted the heavy lid, reached down into the cold, and pulled out your choice Coke, Pepsi, or maybe an orange soda on a hot summer day. The glass was always dripping with condensation, and the weight of the bottle in your hand felt satisfying. You needed a bottle opener, often built right into the cooler or mounted on the wall, and with a crisp pop, the cap came off. The sound alone could make your mouth water. At home, we'd sometimes buy a six-pack to keep in the fridge, the bottles clinking together as Daddy carried them in. When company came over, serving soda in glass bottles felt a little more festive, like we were offering something fancy. The taste seemed sharper and colder than it ever did in cans later on, and there was a ritual to returning the empty bottles. You didn't throw them away, you carried them back to the store, where they were washed and reused, stacked in wooden crates, until they made their way back into circulation. It was a system that worked, and it made the simple act of drinking a soda feel like part of a bigger cycle of community and habit. Looking back, those glass bottles weren't just containers. They were part of the memory itself, tied forever to summers, family gatherings, and the sparkle of something sweet and fizzy. Polaroid cameras felt almost magical in the 1960s, a marvel that let you hold a picture in your hand only moments after you took it. Before then, most photographs meant a trip to the drugstore, leaving your film to be developed, and waiting days or even weeks for the results. With a Polaroid, the thrill was instant. I remember the first time I saw one used at a church picnic. A man snapped a picture, pulled the square photograph from the camera, and with a bit of shaking and waiting, the image slowly appeared. It was like watching a memory develop before your eyes, faint outlines darkening into faces and smiles. Children crowded around, gasping and giggling, as though it were a magic trick. Families loved Polaroids for birthdays, holidays, and vacations, when capturing the moment quickly felt important. The photos themselves had a unique look, with white borders and slightly muted tones that today are instantly recognizable. Our neighbor, Mr. Epstein, bought one and often brought it along to community events, handing out prints that people treasured as keepsakes. Of course, the cameras were not perfect. Sometimes the pictures turned out too dark, too light, or smudged if handled too quickly, but that unpredictability was part of their charm. Unlike film rolls, which were carefully rationed, Polaroids made snapshots feel spontaneous and fun, encouraging people to capture the ordinary along with the special. Looking back, it wasn't just the photos that mattered, it was the wonder of seeing them come to life, a reminder that even technology could carry a touch of delight and surprise. The rotary dial telephone was a fixture in every home during the 1960s, and it carried a certain weight, both physically and in its place in daily life. Ours sat on a small wooden table in the hallway, with a little pad of paper and a pencil nearby for jotting down messages. Using it required patience. You placed your finger into the hole for the number you needed, turned the dial all the way around, and let it spin back with a clicking rhythm before moving on to the next digit. If you made a mistake, you had to start all over again. It was a process that forced you to slow down and be deliberate. Long conversations meant standing in the hall or sitting nearby, the twisted cord tangling as you talked. I remember Mama stretching it as far as it would go into the kitchen, trying to stir a pot while speaking to her sister. There was no privacy if someone else picked up an extension, and you couldn't wander far from the cord. Still, the phone felt like a lifeline. It connected you instantly to friends, family, and neighbors, even if long-distance calls were reserved for special occasions because of the cost. The phone book sat nearby, thick with numbers that gave you access to almost anyone in town. Looking back, the rotary dial was more than a tool. It was part of the rhythm of the household, a presence that rang out sharply in the evenings, breaking the quiet with news, invitations, or sometimes just a friendly voice from down the street. Black and white television sets were the centerpiece of many living rooms in the early 1960s, before color gradually became more common later in the decade. Our family had a bulky set with rabbit ear antennas that often needed adjusting, and it sat in a proud spot against the wall. Watching television was a shared activity, with the family gathered around after supper to catch the nightly programs. I remember the glow that filled the room, the flickering light reflecting across our faces as we watched shows like The Andy Griffith Show or Leave It to Beaver. Even though the images were in shades of gray, our imagination filled in the rest. The snowy static that sometimes appeared was just part of the experience, and often Daddy would rise to fiddle with the dials or reposition the antenna until the picture cleared. Saturday mornings brought cartoons, which felt like a reward after a week of school. News broadcasts carried a different weight, showing the world as it was, without frills, whether it was space launches or civil rights marches. The television was not just entertainment, it was a window to the wider world, shaping conversations at the dinner table and in classrooms the next day. Owning a TV meant being part of a larger story, connected to millions of others watching the same moment unfold. Though color sets would soon take over, there is something about that black and white glow that feels timeless. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to make the world come alive in our own living room, day after day. The typewriter was a familiar sound in homes, schools, and offices throughout the 1960s. Its steady clack of keys striking paper carried a rhythm that became part of daily life. Our school library had several lined up, where students practiced their typing lessons on manual machines, each keystroke demanding firm pressure. At home, Mama used an old Underwood to type up church newsletters, the scent of inked ribbons filling the room. When you pressed a key, a metal arm swung up and struck the page, leaving its sharp impression of a letter. At the end of each line, the carriage had to be pushed back with a satisfying ding, starting a new row of words. Typing was more than a skill, it was a mark of modern efficiency. Offices relied on it for correspondence, businesses for invoices, and families for letters that looked neat and proper. Mistakes were a nuisance, though, since there was no delete button. You either struck through the error, used correction fluid once it came along, or, in many cases, started the page over. Despite its limitations, the typewriter felt important, a machine that gave weight to words and permanence to ideas. For many women, typing provided a path to work outside the home, whether as secretaries, clerks, or teachers. Letters typed and mailed carried a certain dignity, their crisp lines standing apart from handwritten notes. The typewriter taught patience, discipline, and attention to detail, while offering the thrill of hearing words take shape with every keystroke. Looking back, its presence in the 1960s shaped both communication and careers, one click and one line at a time. The milkman's daily delivery was one of those small routines that made the 1960s feel dependable. Families didn't always run to the grocery store for milk, since many towns still had dairies that sent out men in white uniforms with polished trucks. In the early mornings, while the streets were quiet, the milkman would leave glass bottles on the porch, the tops sealed with cardboard caps. Ours often arrived just after sunrise, the bottles standing in a metal carrier that clinked softly when set down. There was something comforting about opening the door and finding fresh milk waiting, still cold from the truck. Children sometimes tried to sneak a sip before breakfast, and the cream that rose to the top of the whole milk was saved by Mama for coffee or baking. It wasn't just milk. Either many milkmen carried butter, eggs, or even cottage cheese, all delivered with a friendly wave and a brief chat if someone happened to be outside. Empty bottles were rinsed and left out for collection, part of a tidy cycle of reuse that kept waste to a minimum. Grocery stores and refrigerators would eventually push the milkman aside, but in those years, his visits were woven into the rhythm of the household. He was more than a delivery man. He was a familiar face who connected families to the farm beyond town, a reminder that food still came from people, not just shelves. Looking back, the milkman represented a kind of neighborly trust and care that seems rare now, a time when even a simple bottle of milk carried with it a feeling of reliability and community. Let that one sink in. When you're ready for the next mystery, hit subscribe. The family encyclopedia set was a proud possession in many 1960s households. Before computers or the internet, these heavy volumes were the gateway to knowledge, their spines often lined up neatly on a bookshelf in the living room or den. Ours were second-hand, a little worn at the edges, but they felt like treasures. Anytime a question came up, whether it was about the planets, a historical figure, or how electricity worked, Mama would point us to the encyclopedia. I remember sitting cross-legged on the carpet, flipping through the thin, glossy pages, the smell of ink and paper strong in the air. The illustrations and photographs brought the subjects to life, even if some of the information grew outdated over time. For school reports, the encyclopedia was the first stop, with notes carefully copied by hand into spiral notebooks. Families who could afford the full set sometimes bought it from a traveling salesman, who promised their children a better education through those bound volumes. It wasn't unusual for kids to get lost in them, wandering from an article about Rome to a map of Africa or a diagram of the human heart. The encyclopedia was more than a reference, it was a symbol of learning and aspiration, a reminder that knowledge belonged in the home as much as in the classroom. Though new editions were costly, many parents considered them a worthy investment, believing they gave their children a chance to understand the world beyond their small town. Looking back, those books were not only resources but also companions, teaching patience and curiosity, one page at a time. Vinyl records and the home record player defined music in the 1960s. Every home seemed to have a stack of albums leaning against the wooden cabinet of a turntable, and playing them was as much a ritual as it was entertainment. You slid the disc carefully from its sleeve, avoiding fingerprints, then set it gently on the spindle. The tone arm was lowered with a soft scratch, followed by the warm crackle before the song began. That crackle alone could send shivers of anticipation. For many families, music was shared rather than private, with the living room filling with the voices of Elvis Presley, the Supremes, or the Beatles. Saturday nights sometimes turned into mini dance parties. Furniture pushed back so children could spin around while parents tapped their feet. Singles spun at 45 RPM, while full albums played at 33, and some players still handled the older 78s. There was no skipping around or shuffling tracks. You listened in order, from start to finish, which made every song feel deliberate. Record stores were gathering places where teenagers flipped through bins, hunting for the newest releases, or carefully saving allowance money for one special purchase. Scratches on a favorite album were mourned, but even those imperfections became part of its sound. The record player stood as a kind of hearth, a source of shared joy that brought people together. It wasn't background noise. It was the event itself, the heart of many evenings spent at home. Looking back, those black discs carried not just music but memory, each spin marking the soundtrack of an entire generation. Polaroid instant cameras felt like pure magic when they appeared in the 1960s. Before then, photographs meant rolls of film that had to be taken to a drugstore or darkroom, with days or even weeks passing before you saw the results. The Polaroid changed all of that. With a click of the shutter and a whir, out slid a square print, still damp with chemicals, waiting to reveal its image. Children would gather around, waving the photo in the air, even though the instructions said to let it develop on its own. The first glimpse of a face or scene appearing on that glossy surface felt almost miraculous. Families used Polaroids for birthdays, holidays, and casual moments that might not have seemed worth a full roll of film. The photos were smaller and often a little faded, but that was part of their charm. The camera itself was bulky, with its bellows-style body unfolding like a gadget from the future. Holding one gave you the feeling of owning something truly modern. They were not cheap, so people used them sparingly, but the novelty was enough to make even simple snapshots feel extraordinary. Friends who visited were often treated to a group picture, a print passed around while everyone laughed over the captured moment. In many ways, the Polaroid was the forerunner of instant sharing, long before digital screens. It gave people a taste of immediacy, a keepsake they could hold within minutes. Those little squares often ended up tucked in wallets, pinned on bulletin boards, or slipped between the pages of a family Bible. They froze life in its everyday motion, right there in the palm of your hand. The rotary dial telephone was a fixture in nearly every home during the 1960s, its round dial and clicking sound instantly recognizable. Our family phone sat on a small wooden stand in the hallway, with a little shelf for the phone book underneath. To make a call, you placed your finger in the proper hole of the dial, turned it all the way until it stopped, and then let it spin back, clicking its way into place. Each number had its own rhythm, and after a while, you could tell which digits someone was dialing just by the sound. Calling took patience, especially with numbers full of 8s and 9s, but it carried a certain charm. The phone was connected by a cord, so conversations often meant standing in one spot or stretching the line as far as it would go. Long-distance calls were a special occasion, sometimes requiring an operator, and they were kept short since every extra minute meant another charge. The phone itself was sturdy, often black or beige, heavy enough to last through years of use. Families treated it as a shared tool rather than a private one, and eavesdropping on another's conversation was an ever-present temptation. The phone book, thick and heavy, sat nearby, offering the names of neighbors, businesses, and services. In many ways, the rotary phone anchored the household. It was both a lifeline to the outside world and a symbol of connection in an age when voices carried warmth over wires rather than through screens. Looking back, that steady click of the dial was the heartbeat of communication in a simpler, more deliberate time. The transistor radio was a marvel of its time, small enough to hold in your hand, yet powerful enough to bring the wider world right into your living room, backyard, or even the beach. Before the 1960s, radios were often bulky pieces of furniture, standing tall in living rooms like wooden monuments. Then came the pocket-sized transistor, light and portable, running on batteries that made it truly mobile. Teenagers especially cherished them, tucking them under pillows at night to catch rock and roll stations broadcasting after dark. The crackle of AM signals, fading in and out with the weather, only added to the magic. Suddenly, music was no longer confined to the family record player or the living room console it traveled with you. Whether you were mowing the lawn, fishing at the lake, or stretched out on the grass with friends. For many, the transistor radio was the first personal gadget, a way to feel connected to the culture of the moment. Baseball games, news bulletins, and late-night shows kept listeners tuned in, while local disc jockeys became voices of authority and fun. The affordability of these radios meant nearly every household had at least one, and they often became companions as constant as a wristwatch. Even though the sound was tinny compared to larger stereos, no one seemed to mind, because what mattered was the freedom it gave. It was independence in a plastic case, a way of claiming a little world of your own. Looking back, the transistor radio marked the beginning of truly portable entertainment, a first step toward the personal technology we take for granted today. Drive-in movie theaters were one of the most beloved pastimes of the 1960s, turning ordinary summer nights into something unforgettable. Families would load up the car with blankets, lawn chairs, and sometimes even a cooler of snacks, though the concession stand was always part of the adventure. There was nothing quite like pulling into a wide-open lot as the sun went down. Rows of cars angled toward the giant glowing screen. Speakers hung from posts and clipped onto car windows, though later some theaters broadcast sound through AM radio. For kids, the experience felt magical watching a story unfold against the backdrop of the night sky, with fireflies flickering in the distance. Parents enjoyed the chance to relax, knowing the children could stretch out in the back seat or even fall asleep before the movie ended. Teenagers saw drive-ins as places of freedom, piling into cars with friends or sharing quieter moments on dates. Double features were common, which meant long evenings spent under the stars. The concession stands, with the smell of popcorn and hot dogs, often ran short cartoon ads reminding audiences to visit the snack bar. Some drive-ins even hosted special events, like church services or community gatherings, adding to their role as social hubs. Though their numbers have dwindled, those glowing screens once stood as symbols of community, leisure, and simple fun. They weren't just about the movie, they were about togetherness, the hum of summer nights, and the shared joy of watching larger-than-life stories play out under the heavens. Jukeboxes were the heartbeat of diners, soda shops, and teen hangouts in the 1960s. Standing tall with glowing lights and polished chrome, they invited you to drop in a coin and hear your favorite song fill the room. For many young people, slipping that nickel or dime into the slot was a small act of power, choosing the soundtrack for everyone present. Rows of numbered cards displayed the titles, everything from Elvis Presley and the Supremes to the Beatles and the Beach Boys. The moment you pressed the buttons, the machine clicked, shuffled, and dropped a record into place, followed by the rich sound of music that turned a simple milkshake into an experience. Couples often danced right there between the booths, while friends argued over which songs deserved a spin. Some diners had tabletop selectors at each booth, so you didn't even need to leave your seat to order up a tune. For teenagers without much spending money, jukeboxes made music accessible in public spaces, long before personal devices. They also became symbols of community and youth culture, uniting people around shared rhythms and voices that defined a generation. Even older folks enjoyed them, sometimes sneaking in a song from an earlier era while the kids groaned. The jukebox was more than a machine, it was a glowing centerpiece, a gathering spot, and an emblem of freedom. Looking back, it reminds us of a time when music was social, shared in public, and carried the power to turn an ordinary diner into a place alive with sound and spirit. The milkman was a familiar figure in many neighborhoods during the 1960s, a quiet symbol of routine and reliability. Before supermarkets became the one-stop shop for everything, fresh milk often came right to the doorstep. Families would leave empty glass bottles outside, sometimes tucked in a metal carrier, and by morning they would be replaced with full ones, capped in paper or foil. Some milkmen delivered cream, butter, and eggs too, making them a vital part of daily life. For children, the clinking of bottles in the early hours was part of the soundtrack of morning, mingling with birdsong and the rumble of passing cars. The bottles themselves were heavy and reusable, a far cry from the disposable cartons that came later. Many households relied on this service not just for convenience but for necessity, since refrigeration was less advanced, and fresh milk spoiled quickly in summer heat. It was also a point of trust. Milkmen often knew their customers by name, greeting them with a wave or a quick word as they made their rounds. Payment might be left in an envelope, tucked neatly into the crate. The arrival of the supermarket gradually made home delivery less common, but during its heyday, the milkman was as regular as the sunrise. For families, it meant waking up to nourishment, already waiting at the door, a small comfort that carried great weight. Looking back, the sight of those glass bottles catching the morning light feels like another piece of ordinary magic, part of the rhythm of a time when life moved with a steadier, more neighborly pace. Main tool for writing letters, school essays, office memos, and even entire books. Ours sat on a heavy oak desk in the corner of the living room, its body sturdy and metallic, with keys that took a firm press to strike. Each letter slammed onto the ribbon, leaving its imprint on paper with a satisfying thunk. The rhythm of typing was unmistakable, fast bursts of clacks followed by the sharp ding of the carriage return, and then the sweeping motion to start a new line. It was noisy, but in a comforting, purposeful way, like the sound of work getting done. Mistakes were not easily forgiven. A slip of the finger meant blotting correction fluid or retyping an entire page. Children sometimes sat and played with the keys, delighting in watching the letters dance up and strike. Businesses relied on whole typing pools, rooms full of mostly young women trained to work quickly and accurately, their machines echoing together like a chorus. At home, a typewriter carried a kind of authority. A typed letter seemed official, weightier than something scrawled in pen. Every household that owned one treated it with care, keeping ribbons fresh and keys clean. Many students remember sitting late into the night with stacks of paper, trying to keep the margins straight, their parents warning them not to hit the keys so hard. It was a skill to master, and the machine demanded patience. By the end of the decade, electric typewriters were appearing, quieter and easier to use, but even those still bore the same mechanical soul. Looking back, the typewriter was more than just a tool. It was a symbol of productivity, discipline, and permanence, in an era when words carried weight and effort left a mark, both on paper and memory. The Polaroid instant camera was one of the most astonishing inventions to come into everyday life during the 1960s. Until then, taking photographs usually meant buying rolls of film, carefully rationing your shots, and then waiting days or even weeks for them to be developed at the local drugstore. When Polaroid introduced its instant models, families suddenly had the thrill of capturing a moment and watching it appear right before their eyes. Children would crowd around as the photographer pulled out the square print, waving it in the air as if that might help the image emerge faster. Slowly, shadows and shapes formed into recognizable faces, a process that felt almost magical. Polaroids quickly became a favorite for birthdays, vacations, and gatherings where the fun of the moment was matched by the excitement of seeing it preserved instantly. The prints themselves were small, with their white borders, and people often tucked them into wallets or pinned them to corkboards. Unlike negatives or slides, Polaroids were one-of-a-kind treasures. If you wanted another copy, you simply had to take another picture. That uniqueness gave each photo a sense of intimacy. The cameras weren't cheap, nor was the film, but the trade-off was convenience. Parents appreciated being able to take pictures of their children without worrying about wasting film. Teenagers loved using them at parties, capturing candid moments that might otherwise slip away. The slight imperfections in the images, the off-colors, the occasional blur added to their charm. Even today, those washed tones are instantly recognizable, a look that no digital filter can truly replicate. In many ways, the Polaroid foreshadowed the instant gratification we now associate with smartphones. Yet, in the 1960s, it was revolutionary, turning photography into something immediate, social, and wonderfully tangible. To hold a warm print in your hands just seconds after the shutter clicked was to hold a little piece of memory itself. The rotary telephone was more than a household item in the 1960s. It was a lifeline, a fixture that tied families to the wider world. Sitting proudly on a small table or hanging on a kitchen wall, it often occupied a central spot in the home. The design was simple yet distinct: a heavy handset, a coiled cord, and a circular dial with finger holes. To make a call, you placed your finger in the right number and spun the dial clockwise until it stopped, then let it whirl back with a soft clicking rhythm. Each number had its own measured delay, so dialing a long-distance call required patience. Because there were no answering machines or caller ID, every ring carried a sense of anticipation. You never knew who would be on the other end: a friend, a family member, or sometimes just the wrong number. Conversations were shared by the whole household, with others listening in or politely waiting their turn. The length of the cord determined your privacy. Some cords barely stretched beyond the stand, while others wound through doorways, allowing teenagers to pull the phone into the hallway and whisper secrets. Party lines were still common in rural areas, meaning several households shared one phone line. Picking up the receiver might reveal a neighbor already chatting, and etiquette dictated you hang up and wait your turn. For children, this setup was a source of fascination and, at times, mild frustration. Long-distance calls were expensive and often reserved for holidays or emergencies, with parents reminding kids not to tie up the line. The rotary phone demanded attention and intention. You didn't casually dial, you committed. Its weight, sound, and deliberate pace made communication feel important, almost ceremonial. Looking back, those spinning dials and echoing clicks remind us of a time when reaching out to someone carried a rhythm all its own. The transistor radio was one of the most treasured possessions of the 1960s, especially for young people who suddenly had a way to carry music and voices wherever they went. Before this invention, radios were large pieces of furniture, heavy sets that sat in the living room and required the whole family to gather around. The transistor changed that by shrinking everything into a small, battery-powered device that fit easily in a pocket or purse. With it, teenagers could listen to their favorite rock and roll stations in private, away from the watchful eyes of parents who might have preferred big band or country. The portability was revolutionary. Kids brought transistor radios to the beach, to picnics, or simply out onto the front porch on a warm summer night. Baseball games, top 40 countdowns, and news bulletins suddenly traveled with you, a constant companion humming softly at your side. The sound was tinny compared to the full consoles, but that hardly mattered. What mattered was freedom. Music and voices were no longer tied to a piece of furniture. Many families owned more than one, since they were affordable and practical. Fathers listened to sports scores in the garage while working on cars. Mothers tuned in to talk programs while folding laundry, and children clutched their radios to catch the latest Beatles song before it disappeared from the charts. At night, kids sometimes hid them under their pillows, turning the volume low so parents wouldn't notice. The transistor radio also shaped culture by spreading music faster than ever before. Fads, hits, and news traveled instantly, creating a shared soundtrack for a generation. That little box of wires and circuits gave people access to the world, offering entertainment, comfort, and even escape. It may seem simple now, but in its day, the transistor radio was pure magic. The jukebox was more than a machine that played records. It was a cultural landmark of the 1960s. Found in diners, bowling alleys, soda shops, and bars, it lit up with neon colors, chrome trim, and the promise of music on demand. Drop in a coin, flip through the glossy title cards, and press a combination of letters and numbers to bring your favorite song to life. The mechanical arm would swing into motion, pulling a vinyl single from its stack and setting it on the turntable with a satisfying clunk. Then came the scratch of the needle, followed by the unmistakable sound of music filling the room. For teenagers, the jukebox was a kind of social stage. Groups gathered around, debating which songs to play, sometimes putting in coins just to hear the same track on repeat. Couples slow danced by the glowing lights, while friends used it to test the latest hits and discover new artists. A diner wasn't complete without the constant hum of a jukebox in the background, its selections shaping the mood as much as the food or the company. The machine held a power that reached beyond convenience. It gave ordinary people control over the atmosphere, letting them choose joy, romance, or rebellion with the push of a button. Adults might roll their eyes at the endless stream of rock and roll, but for young people, feeding the jukebox felt like taking part in something bigger. Even today, when we carry thousands of songs in our pockets, the memory of standing in front of a jukebox still carries magic. It was tactile, it was glowing, and it was shared. In that moment, as the music began to play, everyone in the room was part of the same soundtrack. The record player was at the heart of home entertainment in the 1960s, a piece of furniture as important as the couch or dining table. Many were housed in large wooden consoles, polished and heavy, with built-in speakers that filled the room with music. Others were smaller, portable models, perfect for teenagers who wanted their own space to listen away from their parents. The ritual of playing a record was almost ceremonial. You slid the vinyl disc from its sleeve, careful not to touch the grooves, placed it on the turntable, and gently set the needle down. Then, with a soft crackle, music would flow warm, rich, and alive in a way that still feels unmatched. For families, the record player brought the world closer. Frank Sinatra, the Supremes, the Beatles, and Johnny Cash could all perform in your living room for the price of a record. Saturday afternoons often turned into listening parties, with kids sprawled on the rug and parents humming along while cooking or reading. Teenagers, especially, treasured their records, saving up allowance money to buy the latest single or LP, then playing it over and over until every lyric was memorized. Unlike the endless streaming of today, choices were limited, which made each record feel precious. Flipping a vinyl over, studying the cover art, and reading the liner notes gave you a deeper connection to the artist. Friends shared records like secrets, trading albums, or inviting one another over to listen. It was social, but also deeply personal, as songs tied themselves to moments and memories. The record player wasn't just about sound, it was about presence. The feel of the disc, the artwork, the delicate hiss before the song began all contributed to an experience that was both physical and emotional. For many, the music of the 1960s still lives in those grooves, waiting to spin again. Drive-in theaters were one of the defining joys of mid-century America, and by the 1960s, they were at their peak. A giant outdoor screen, rows of parked cars, and the smell of popcorn drifting through the summer night created a setting that was as much about community as it was about film. Families piled into station wagons with blankets and lawn chairs, while teenagers in convertibles sought a little freedom under the stars. You paid at the entrance booth, found your spot, and hooked the tinny speaker onto your car window or later, tuned into a local radio frequency when technology caught up. The movies were only part of the magic. Parents could bring babies without worrying about disrupting anyone. Kids ran around in pajamas before the show started, and young couples carved out a pocket of privacy in the back seat. The drive-in was an affordable night out, with double features stretching late into the evening and snack bars offering hot dogs, candy, and sodas. Some theaters even had playgrounds beneath the screen, so children could tire themselves out before the opening credits rolled. There was something electric about watching a film outdoors. The stars above competing with the glow of the projector. Fireflies might dart through the air, and the sound of crickets mixed with dialogue from the screen. It was casual, imperfect, and wonderfully human. Unlike the hushed stillness of an indoor theater, drive-ins buzzed with laughter, whispers, and the occasional honking horn. For many, the drive-in wasn't just about movies at all. It was about being part of something bigger. It was community stitched together by headlights, laughter, and flickering reels of film. Today, though most are gone, the memory of those glowing summer nights remains vivid, a reminder of a time when entertainment meant piling everyone into the car and heading out to share a story under the open sky. The typewriter was the heartbeat of offices, schools, and homes in the 1960s. Before computers, every letter, report, or school paper was hammered out one keystroke at a time on a heavy, mechanical machine. Each press of a key sent a small metal arm forward to strike the ribbon, imprinting ink onto paper with a satisfying snap. The sound was constant in any workplace. The clatter of typing mixed with the ding of a carriage return and the swish as the roller moved back into place. It was noisy, but to many, that noise meant productivity, focus, and progress. In offices, secretaries and clerks worked tirelessly on typewriters, filling out forms, typing correspondence, and keeping records in neat stacks of carbon-copied pages. At home, students used them for essays, and aspiring writers stayed up late, pounding out stories or poems, the steady rhythm of the keys pushing their imagination forward. Typewriters demanded discipline. Mistakes were not easily erased. Whiteout fluid or correction tape came later, but in the early years, errors often meant starting over, which taught people patience and accuracy. There was also something deeply personal about the typewriter, the force of a person's touch, the slight inconsistencies in pressure, even the faint smudge of a ribbon created a document that carried human presence. Every page felt alive in a way that today's uniform, digital text rarely does. For many, their typewriter became a trusted companion, an instrument that gave voice to ideas, love letters, business ventures, or heartfelt apologies. Though heavy and sometimes temperamental, typewriters symbolized progress and opportunity. They gave ordinary people the ability to put their words into the world with authority and permanence. Looking back, the hum of an office filled with typewriters or the quiet persistence of one tapping away at night feels like a soundtrack to an era when words were carved directly into the fabric of daily life. When the Polaroid camera arrived in the 1960s, it felt like a small miracle. For the first time, people could take a picture and hold the memory in their hands within minutes. No waiting for film to be developed at a drugstore. No envelopes of glossy prints arriving weeks later. You pointed, clicked, and out slid a square of paper that slowly came to life, the image revealing itself as if by magic. Families gathered around, waving the picture in the air, watching faces and colors emerge from the milky blur. It turned photography into an event, a shared moment of wonder that brought people closer. The Polaroid made everyday life feel special. Parents documented birthdays, picnics, and holidays. Teenagers snapped candid shots of friends, taping them to bedroom mirrors or slipping them into scrapbooks. The immediacy of the camera changed the way people thought about photography. It was no longer just for weddings or formal occasions. Suddenly, small details of daily life could be preserved on a whim. Even the slight imperfections, the odd lighting or off-center framing, gave Polaroids their charm. Polaroids also carried a certain honesty. Unlike staged portraits, they caught people as they were in the moment, laughing mid-bite, hair tousled, or surprised by the flash. They felt raw and real, in a way that traditional photos often didn't. The white border became iconic, a frame that instantly evoked nostalgia, even back then. In a world where developing film could be expensive, Polaroid cameras gave families and young people more freedom to experiment. They encouraged creativity, spontaneity, and play. The images might fade or curl with time, but the memories they held stayed vivid in the hearts of those who lived them. The Polaroid was not just a camera, it was a time machine in your pocket, offering the thrill of instant memory making long before smartphones existed. The rotary telephone was one of the most recognizable fixtures in a 1960s home. Heavy, solid, and often placed in a central spot like the kitchen or living room, it served as the household's lifeline to the outside world. Its circular dial required patience. You slipped your finger into the right hole, rotated it until it stopped, and waited as it whirred back into place before moving on to the next number. Calling someone took time, and if you made a mistake, you had to start all over again. That deliberate process made each phone call feel purposeful, not something done casually in passing. Most families had just one phone, sometimes two if they were lucky. Long cords allowed mothers to stir a pot of soup while chatting with a neighbor, or teenagers to stretch into the hallway for a little privacy. Conversations weren't unlimited either. Long-distance calls were expensive, so people chose their words carefully, saving deep talks for nearby friends and family while keeping distant chats short and to the point. Every ring of the phone carried weight because it could mean important news, a surprise from a relative, or a simple hello from a friend. The sound of the rotary dial itself became part of daily life, a mechanical rhythm paired with the familiar click and hum of connecting lines. There was no caller ID, no voicemail, and no texting. If you missed a call, you simply missed it. And if you wanted to talk to someone, you called their home and hoped they were there. The phone was less about convenience and more about connection, real, human connection that demanded patience and attention. Looking back, the rotary telephone was more than a machine. It was a piece of furniture, a shared tool, and a bridge between households. Its sturdy frame and slow rhythm remind us of a time when communication was a deliberate act, not an endless stream of notifications. The transistor radio was a revelation in the 1960s. Small, lightweight, and powered by batteries, it put the world into the palm of your hand. Before its arrival, radios were large pieces of furniture that anchored a living room, but the transistor broke that mold. Teenagers could tuck one under their pillow at night, secretly listening to rock and roll stations long after their parents thought they were asleep. Workers carried them to job sites, fishermen brought them along on the water, and families took them on picnics where music and baseball games played against the backdrop of summer laughter. What made the transistor so special was not just its portability, but its role in shaping culture. For the first time, music became truly personal. Kids no longer had to fight over the family radio, they could carry their own station with them. Blaring the Beatles or the Supremes while walking down the street, it turned music into a soundtrack for everyday life. Whether you were mowing the lawn, cruising in a car, or hanging out at the park, the transistor radio made the world feel closer, more immediate, and more alive. News also traveled faster through those little speakers. The voices of presidents, the coverage of the moon landing, or updates from the civil rights movement all reached ordinary people wherever they happened to be. It wasn't confined to living rooms anymore, it spilled out into the open air. The transistor was, in its own way, a democratizer of information and sound. Looking back, the tinny crackle of a transistor radio has its own magic. The sound wasn't perfect, but the experience was. It gave people freedom, independence, and a sense of belonging to a bigger world. For many, those small radios were a trusted companion, always ready to bring comfort, excitement, or simply a little music to brighten the day. The transistor radio was a revelation in the 1960s. Small, lightweight, and powered by batteries, it put the world into the palm of your hand. Before its arrival, radios were large pieces of furniture that anchored a living room, but the transistor broke that mold. Teenagers could tuck one under their pillow at night, secretly listening to rock and roll stations long after their parents thought they were asleep. Workers carried them to job sites. Fishermen brought them along on the water, and families took them on picnics where music and baseball games played against the backdrop of summer laughter. What made the transistor so special was not just its portability, but its role in shaping culture. For the first time, music became truly personal. Kids no longer had to fight over the family radio, they could carry their own station with them. Blaring the Beatles or the Supremes while walking down the street, it turned music into a soundtrack for everyday life. Whether you were mowing the lawn, cruising in a car, or hanging out at the park, the transistor radio made the world feel closer, more immediate, and more alive. News also traveled faster through those little speakers. The voices of presidents, the coverage of the moon landing, or updates from the civil rights movement all reached ordinary people wherever they happened to be. It wasn't confined to living rooms anymore, it spilled out into the open air. The transistor was, in its own way, a democratizer of information and sound. Looking back, the tinny crackle of a transistor radio has its own magic. The sound wasn't perfect, but the experience was. It gave people freedom, independence, and a sense of belonging to a bigger world. For many, those small radios were a trusted companion, always ready to bring comfort, excitement, or simply a little music to brighten the day. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here. Subscribe. Vinyl records in the 1960s were more than just a way to listen to music. They were an experience. Every album was a tangible piece of art, a 12-inch disc tucked into a colorful sleeve that often told as much of a story as the music itself. Sliding a record out, carefully setting it on the turntable, and placing the needle down was a ritual. The gentle crackle that greeted the first notes felt like a secret signal that you were about to enter another world. Music wasn't something you carried around in your pocket, it was something you gave your full attention to, sitting in a room, letting the sound fill every corner. Records shaped social life too. Teenagers gathered in living rooms and basements to listen to the latest singles, passing around albums like prized possessions. Each record represented more than a song, it was an identity, a way of declaring what you stood for and what kind of person you wanted to be. Parents might not have understood the fuzz of electric guitars or the pounding of drums, but young listeners clung to those sounds as a lifeline. Owning a Beatles album or a Motown single meant being part of a movement bigger than yourself. Albums also carried with them the joy of discovery. Liner notes, photographs, and cover art offered a window into the world of the musicians. The music wasn't disposable, it demanded presence and appreciation. To flip a record from side A to side B was to linger longer, to let a whole album play through instead of skipping from one hit to the next. Looking back, vinyl was both fragile and enduring. Records could scratch, warp, or crack, but when cared for, they could last decades, still spinning out the same songs. For many, those grooves preserved not only music, but memories of youth, love, and change. The typewriter was one of the most essential tools of the 1960s, humming away in offices, schools, and homes across the country. Long before computers reshaped communication, the typewriter was the machine that carried thoughts from mind to page, with an almost mechanical poetry. Each keystroke struck with a satisfying clack, leaving an indelible mark on paper. Secretaries filled office buildings with their rhythmic tapping, turning correspondence and reports into neat rows of inked letters. Students used portable models for essays and term papers, lugging them between dorm rooms and libraries. Even at home, families kept a typewriter nearby for letters, recipes, or household bookkeeping. What made typewriters indispensable was their permanence. A handwritten note could fade or smudge, but typewritten words felt official and lasting. Business contracts, love letters, and even novels were all hammered out one keystroke at a time. Yet the process demanded patience and skill. A single mistake could throw off an entire page, requiring either messy correction fluid or starting over entirely. Many people became masters of precision, learning to measure words carefully before committing them to the page. There was also something deeply personal about a typewriter. Each machine had its own quirks. Some keys stuck, some rattled louder than others, and some required a firmer touch. Writers grew attached to their typewriters the way musicians cling to instruments. Famous authors of the era, from Jack Kerouac to Sylvia Plath, produced their work on these sturdy machines, turning metal and ink into timeless literature. For ordinary people, the typewriter wasn't just a machine of work, it was a bridge to the world. Letters typed to distant family carried weight and care, often tucked into envelopes that traveled across states or oceans. The typewriter gave people the power to put their voice into print, to make their words look strong and important. Looking back, its clatter was more than noise. It was the sound of ideas taking form, of lives being recorded one sentence at a time. The jukebox was the heartbeat of many diners, soda shops, and bowling alleys in the 1960s. Tall, glowing, and often trimmed in chrome, it drew people in with its flashing lights and the promise of music at the touch of a button. For a coin or two, you could pick your favorite song and fill the room with sound, instantly changing the mood. Teenagers gathered around jukeboxes after school, debating which track to play next, sometimes slipping in a secret choice just to see how their friends reacted. Couples claimed songs as their own, letting the music say what words couldn't. The jukebox wasn't only about music, it was about community. In a time before personal headphones, listening was a shared experience. If someone played a new hit, everyone in the room heard it together. You could measure popularity by how many times a single record spun in an evening. Local jukeboxes even helped launch careers, as repeated plays turned unknown tracks into national hits. There was also a ritual to the jukebox: flipping through the titles, pressing the heavy buttons, and hearing the clunk as the machine pulled out the chosen record gave the act a certain ceremony. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was alive. A jukebox could turn an ordinary night into something memorable, filling diners with the soundtrack of youth and freedom. The rotary telephone was a fixture in nearly every household during the 1960s, perched on kitchen counters, hallway tables, or mounted on walls. Its round dial, with finger holes for each number, made calling a deliberate act. You placed your finger in the circle, spun it to the metal stop, and listened as the dial clicked back into place. Calling someone wasn't instant, it took time, which gave each connection a kind of weight. Families often had one shared phone, and that meant calls weren't private. A teenager hoping to whisper to a boyfriend or girlfriend often found themselves interrupted by a parent needing the line. Phone calls themselves carried a certain etiquette. People answered politely, introduced themselves, and conversations rarely dragged on since long-distance charges could climb quickly. A long-distance call was reserved for big news births, emergencies, or holidays, and families sometimes gathered around the phone so everyone could say a few words. The rotary phone also tethered people to place. If you were expecting a call, you stayed near home, listening for the bell, missed the ring, and you missed the message. For all its limits, though, the phone connected people in ways letters could not. Voices carried warmth, emotion, and urgency. Looking back, the rotary phone's steady ring and the slow spin of its dial feel almost meditative compared to today's instant communication. It was a time when every call mattered, and every voice on the line was worth waiting for. The slide projector was one of the most magical household devices of the 1960s, turning living rooms into little theaters of memory. Families gathered after vacations or special events as the lights were dimmed and the whir of the projector filled the room. A carousel tray clicked slowly, feeding one slide after another onto the screen or a blank wall. Suddenly, moments that had been frozen in tiny pieces of film were magnified and brought to life. Children groaned when Dad insisted on showing every single picture, but deep down, they loved being part of the ritual. For many, the slide projector was more than just entertainment, it was storytelling. Parents narrated each photo, recalling who was there, what happened, and sometimes laughing at the unexpected blur or awkward pose. These evenings created a sense of family identity, weaving shared experiences into a collective memory. The equipment itself had a presence. Projectors grew warm as the bulb burned, and sometimes slides jammed, bringing the show to a pause while someone tried to fix it. The faint smell of heated dust mixed with the sound of laughter made the experience unforgettable. Unlike today's instant photo sharing, slides demanded patience. Pictures had to be developed, mounted, and arranged, turning photography into something deliberate and cherished. In a world before digital screens, the slide projector brought families together in the glow of remembered summers, birthdays, and journeys, moments too important to keep hidden in a box. The Polaroid camera felt like science fiction when it arrived in homes during the 1960s. Instead of waiting days or weeks for film to be developed, families could snap a picture and hold the memory in their hands within minutes. Children watched in awe as a small square photograph slid out of the camera, still blank, and slowly revealed its image, like magic. Parents waved the film in the air, believing it helped the picture develop faster, even though the process worked on its own. The thrill of seeing a moment captured instantly gave the Polaroid a special place in birthdays, vacations, and holiday gatherings. For many, it changed the way people thought about photography. Suddenly, pictures could be casual, spontaneous, and even playful. You didn't need to worry about wasting an entire roll of film at the drugstore. You could take a picture, see it right away, and try again if you didn't like the result. That immediacy gave people freedom to experiment, whether posing silly with friends or capturing everyday moments that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Polaroid photos also carried a particular charm. The white border, the slightly muted colors, and the soft finish gave them a distinctive look. Families often tucked them into albums, pinned them to corkboards, or slipped them into wallets. Unlike professional prints, Polaroids felt intimate and personal, little snapshots of life unfolding. The Polaroid camera didn't just take pictures, it changed the rhythm of memory making, offering instant proof that a moment was worth keeping. The transistor radio was the soundtrack of the 1960s, a pocket-sized wonder that brought music, news, and baseball games wherever you went. Unlike bulky tube radios that stayed in the living room, the transistor was small, light, and ran on batteries, making it the first truly portable way to tune in. Teenagers carried them to parks, beaches, and backyard hangouts, turning any spot into a party. For the first time, young people could listen to rock and roll away from the watchful eyes of parents, sharing the latest hits with friends while sprawled on picnic blankets or cruising in cars. Its popularity wasn't only about music. Families used transistor radios to follow local news, weather updates, or political events, especially during the turbulent years of the decade. Sports fans tuned in to play-by-play broadcasts no matter where they were, sometimes huddling around a single radio at work or on fishing trips. The little devices became symbols of freedom and immediacy, shrinking the world to fit in the palm of your hand. The sound was tinny compared to larger sets, but that hardly mattered. What mattered was access and the feeling of independence it created. Kids tucked them under pillows late at night to catch forbidden stations, twisting the dial slowly to bring in distant voices that seemed to float through the dark. The transistor radio turned music into something personal yet shareable, laying the foundation for the portable listening culture that still defines how we experience sound today. The TV dinner was more than just a frozen meal in the 1960s. It was a symbol of modern convenience. Packaged neatly in a compartmentalized aluminum tray, it promised a full dinner without the effort of peeling, chopping, or simmering. Introduced in the 1950s, these ready-made meals reached peak popularity in the following decade as families embraced the idea of quick, no-fuss dinners that paired perfectly with America's newest household companion, the television set. For many children, TV dinners felt like a treat. Each little section revealed its own surprise: a portion of Salisbury steak, mashed potatoes with a neat divot of gravy, a vegetable medley, and perhaps a brownie baked right in the tray. The novelty was in the orderliness, as if dinner had been prearranged just for you. Sitting on a folding tray table in the living room, kids balanced their meal while watching their favorite programs. Mothers, often still expected to cook daily meals from scratch, sometimes welcomed TV dinners as a break. They weren't gourmet, but they were reliable, cheap, and quick. Even if the peas turned mushy or the dessert tasted faintly metallic, the idea of enjoying dinner in front of the television was exciting. It turned mealtime into entertainment. Looking back, TV dinners represented both progress and compromise. They offered families flexibility and a touch of novelty, but also hinted at the beginning of a shift away from the traditional family dinner table. Cigarette vending machines were once a familiar sight in the 1960s, tucked into diners, bowling alleys, and bus stations. They were sleek, metal boxes lined with rows of brightly colored packs, each promising sophistication or coolness. For a few coins, you could pull a heavy lever and watch as a pack of cigarettes dropped with a satisfying thud into the tray. No questions asked, no clerk watching. The machines were everywhere, and their accessibility made smoking seem not only ordinary but almost expected. It's hard to overstate just how normal cigarettes were in daily life then. Doctors still appeared in ads, athletes endorsed certain brands, and television commercials often made smoking seem glamorous. Teenagers, though not legally allowed, often found ways to get a pack from these machines, adding to their reputation as a rite of passage. They were symbols of independence, even rebellion, sitting in plain view in places where families gathered. Yet, behind the novelty and convenience, the darker truth was already lurking. Health warnings were starting to emerge more loudly by the mid-1960s, with the Surgeon General's 1964 report linking smoking to lung cancer and heart disease. Still, for years after, the machines stood largely unchallenged, humming quietly in public spaces. They're gone now, replaced by a far stricter approach to tobacco. But for those who lived through that era, the memory of slipping coins into a vending machine and walking away with a shiny new pack lingers as part of the texture of 1960s life. The vinyl record player was the heartbeat of the home in the 1960s, a piece of furniture as much as it was a machine. Families often had large console stereos that doubled as cabinets, with polished wood finishes and fabric speaker covers that blended into the living room. To play a record was to create an atmosphere, whether it was the smooth harmonies of the Supremes, the electrifying guitar of Jimi Hendrix, or the soothing voice of Frank Sinatra. Music wasn't something you scrolled through. It was an event. You placed the needle carefully on the groove and listened to the crackle before the first note came alive. Teenagers spent hours flipping through albums at record stores, saving allowance money to buy the latest release. Each purchase carried weight because records weren't cheap. When you owned one, you cherished it, studying the cover art and liner notes as the songs played. Friends gathered to share listening sessions, sometimes debating lyrics, sometimes just swaying quietly together. The ritual of the record player extended beyond music. It taught patience, since you had to listen to entire sides before changing. It demanded care, as scratches or dust could ruin the sound. It also encouraged connection, because putting on a record was often a shared choice, setting the tone for an evening or a gathering. Today, vinyl has made a comeback, but in the 1960s, it was never a niche. It was the standard, a warm, living presence in homes that defined how people experienced sound. That was one layer. Take a moment, then subscribe, and we'll go deeper next time.